So in January, a small Chinese tech company of around 200 employees made history when it managed to wipe out $1 trillion in stock market value in a single day. That company, DeepSeek, had just launched a new large language model in the same vein as OpenAI's ChatGPT. Now, in some ways, you might think, well, they're just competing with Silicon Valley. But here's the thing, DeepSeek produced its revolutionary new language model for just $6 million, a pittance compared to the budgets of its Silicon Valley counterparts. And the company claimed that they only utilized a couple of thousand older generation chips, these are the physical chips that actually run the software, compared to the 50,000 state-of-the-art chips reportedly used by OpenAI to build the latest version of ChatGPT. So the ramifications were enormous and immediate. Nvidia, the American chip manufacturing titan, saw 17% shaved off its stock price. American tech entrepreneurs were uncharacteristically humble, while the Chinese press trumpeted the historic moment marked by this upstart company's humiliation of its American rivals. Watching all this unfold, you can read it on the one hand purely as a story about economics and tech bros. But another way of looking at it is that these struggles over the virtual spaces that increasingly govern our lives will accordingly have an ever greater impact on us. Because most of us operate in an environment mediated by US tech companies, Google and Meta and Apple. We're not familiar with what it might be like to live in an environment mediated by, for example, Chinese tech companies. And if those tech companies are setting the rules of the road, the destination we end up in might be quite different. One man who certainly thinks so is Bruno Maçães. Bruno is a philosopher and was even for a time Portugal's Secretary of State for European Affairs, before becoming a commentator and a journalist. He now writes about tech and foreign affairs for the New Statesman, and he's just brought out a new book, World Builders, Technology and the New Geopolitics. Bruno writes in the book about a discussion he was having with the Ukrainian intellectual Volodymyr Yermolenko, and looking at the ruins into which very real Russian bombs had rendered much of his home country, Yermolenko asked Bruno whether he might have reconsidered his ideas about the primacy of virtual experiences on everyday life. And you can understand why. I mean, Yermolenko is looking at the rubble created in the real world when bombs meet steel. It's not a software construction, it's not a virtual world. It's very real. And he's wondering how it is possible that this virtual world that Bruno is so interested in trumps the real world that he's experiencing. How could the dangers of the virtual world compare to the dangers in the real world? And Bruno writes in his book, "My answer was that we had to remain faithful to both levels of the conflict. There is a level close to the physical land and to the heroism of the battle that no one should dispute or belittle. But there is also a second level where much or all will ultimately be decided, the level of technology, energy, trade and finance, of manipulating the system. This is the level of world building." This is The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's my conversation with Bruno. Bruno Maçães, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Great to be here.
We will get to Yermolenko's critique shortly, because we do live in a world where these hard realities matter and where they have intruded upon the real world in Ukraine and Gaza and Syria and DRC. But I want to start with this idea of world builders. Define for me, if you will, this central idea behind your new book.
There are different ways to look at it. One way is, how do we get world order? What kind of world order do we have? Is it a Western world order? Was it a Christian world order in the past? But all these concepts end up being disputed. There's no end of history. There's no set of beliefs or principles that is going to organize world politics. And so I started to think, is there a way to ask and answer this question at a different level? Rather than having a given world order, we have rules for building world order. We have higher level rules that determine how world order is going to be built, because it is always being destroyed and built anew. There is no end of history. So this is how I get to the concept. And then the more practical way is around 2018, when in fact this concept started to to attract me. I kept hearing about this idea that the world might become Chinese. And I guess it might become Chinese, then it is American now. And so you have to ask seriously the question, what does it mean to say the world is Chinese or American, rather than physical or God-given or the product of physical and biological evolution or whatever, right? The world has become geopolitical, has become political, has become defined, constructed, built by the great powers.
And I think the reason I was surprised by your eventual answer is that because you have a political background yourself, I thought you might end up trying to answer it on the level of geopolitics. But you don't. You answer it a kind of on a level above that. So the central idea behind this book is that the worlds of tech and geopolitics are on this collision course. And then once they meet, they will be divided into two levels. And you have essentially those that are creating the tech, which is now driven by AI and these large language models, ChatGPT and DeepSeek. And they are in the driving seat. They are creating the conditions, they are writing the codes, and they are developing the rules. And then everybody else is interacting with that world that they have created.
Yes, power has become the power to set the fundamental conditions, the landscape within which other actors operate. Now, it's possible for states to rise to the higher level, but the structure, the two levels, that I think is permanent, particularly in our modern world, is going to become the geopolitics of the future.
So when people say we're living in an American world, you're living in a Chinese world, essentially what that means is that the people who have built that world are operating according to the rules of those countries or groups within those countries.
Yes, that's already the case, but becoming increasingly the case because the world is becoming very malleable and open to technological creation and manipulation. That's the variable that has changed. Therefore, physical reality is becoming irrelevant. And it's geopolitical reality. Reality has built by the most powerful states that is relevant for our lives and for political life and for world politics.
And you don't mean it in a rhetorical way. You mean that literally reality is being created. You say this in the book, quote, when your opponent is building a fully artificial or technological world that could eventually redefine your own reality, geopolitics becomes not merely existential, but ontological.
Yes, the book is pretty ambitious, I think I can say. I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad, but I think one can agree that it is ambitious. And it's ambitious because at some point I decided I'm not just going to suggest that this is the case in some areas. I'm going to suggest that the world is built from the ground up in every area. And you have noticed that in the last chapter, I take on the difficult case of energy, because often people will say, okay, lots of the stuff that you're talking about, it's right, it's correct, they are virtual in nature, but how about something as fundamental and as physical as energy?
Right.
And I even try to argue we're moving to a world where even energy is becoming virtual. So you're right, it is a bold premise that I then tried to deliver. It took about almost 2 years to write, because the difficult thing about it was to try to deliver on that premise and to try to show that it works sort of across the board.
Yeah. I mean, you've been gifted this DeepSeek situation, because I think perhaps before DeepSeek, if you had said to people, well, actually, we live in an American world and we could potentially live in a Chinese world, they would have said, well, actually, the rules of the road that Silicon Valley are creating are in some ways, they're some way universal. But I think what we've seen with DeepSeek is that actually nation states can very easily rewrite them in a way that suits them.
Yes. I can't say I was surprised. I knew it was going to happen. My only question was in what area exactly. I think we're on for even bigger surprises coming from China. And I think the question one has to ask is, if a 200 people company of very young people, all of them in the research team educated in China, by the way, if they were able to do this.
That's crucially important. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's crucially important.
Yeah, crucially important, because it seems clear that China is now almost entirely self-sufficient. They don't even need to send these young prodigies to universities in the US anymore. That is a big change, and almost every country in the world does need to do that, even in Europe.
Yeah.
And so if these kids were able to do this, and by the way, they were able to do this without political support. Xi Jinping was surprised when this happened. There's a photo yesterday.
Right, when they all got together with Xi Jinping, they were thinking about Alibaba and other places.
Yeah.
And suddenly out of nowhere, this team popped up.
Yeah, Liang Wenfeng is the head of DeepSeek, and there's a photo where Xi Jinping shakes his hand, and everyone around them is like looking amused but somehow proud that this guy appear a bit of out of nowhere. And this is different. It's not what we expect from China. But obviously, if he was able to do this with very little political support, we can imagine that in those large, publicly founded, giant companies that have been created in the past 5 years, other surprises are being prepared. And we should be ready for that, not only in AI, but in energy, for example, in semiconductors, and so on. I think it's a wake-up call, as people like to say, but it gets us rid of the illusions that China was falling behind and that it couldn't do more than it's done in the past, that it had hit some kind of roadblocks. I think we now know better than that after DeepSeek.
Do you have some sense of what these surprises might be?
There's a lot of rumors going around that perhaps China is coming up with a different way to build semiconductors. You know that they are built essentially with this, I describe it in the book at some length, with this kind of black magic technology called extreme ultraviolet light. And this is how you carve the features in a semiconductor. They're the size of just a few atoms or maybe even one atom, the transistors in each chip. And China, because it's been deprived of the machines to do this, is looking into other solutions. That would be quite a scientific, technological revolution if that happens. It's just like there are rumors going around between people who know about a little bit about what's happening. It could be other areas that surprise us, but we have to start thinking of China as, in fact, quite capable of bringing about fundamental technological changes rather than just catching up.
Are you surprised by this? As someone who's worked in European policy, it seems to me, and this I guess is not a nice thought, but it seems to me extraordinary that we could be living in a world where the West is no longer at the cutting edge of technology.
Yeah, it is a change. You know, it's not a generational change. It's not a secular change. It's fundamentally changes how the world has been for 500 years, 600 years. It's a big deal. No, I lived in China for almost 2 years just before the pandemic, and that's where I came to some of these realizations, you know. It's just the way things are. I don't repeat them because I have some kind of sympathy for China. Sometimes people will tell me, you're saying this because you have sympathy for China. And, you know, lots of people actually try to hide these realities because it's politically convenient. I won't do that. And what I saw in China was, in fact, that kind of dynamism. One experience that marked me, and I like to talk about it, is going to a big internet conference and seeing the Internet Awards of the Year being given to young internet entrepreneurs. And the whole thing felt like a rock concert. These young entrepreneurs, all of them male, by the way, but that's no longer the case with DeepSeek, where some of the most important researchers are female. But anyway, all of them male would go on stage and they would receive the adulation of the crowd. This would be thousands of people in the audience. The young males would receive the adulation of young women in the crowd, by the way. And, you know, they were rock stars.
Okay.
So, you know, I'm sitting there at the end of the auditorium and thinking, there's no way this is not going to produce results, because this is not just investment. This is emotional investment in being successful here. There's a kind of a passion that in Europe you're going to find it in football.
Right. What did you make of did you see this comment by the former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, where he said that for the audience, the US is falling behind because they are, exactly as you say, they are glorifying the people who are on the football field, and they're not glorifying the people who are writing the code and doing the maths.
Yeah, you know, interesting. Of course, someone should have advised them that you can't criticize fundamental American cultural traits. That's not what MAGA is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about elevating them. Anyway, you made that mistake, but it was also revealing, by the way, of a kind of cultural influence that now is flowing in reverse. That you have elements in American society that are actually looking up to India and to China. And in fact, the Vice President Vance, remember the other comment that got very famous, we all discuss now these things that happen on Twitter, but the other comment about the different orders of love and attachment, that we should be attached to our family and then to our community and then to our city. Then Vance argued this is the Christian way. And he was criticized because obviously it's not the Christian way. If you read the Gospels, in fact, a lot of what moves Jesus is to argue against this view towards a certain universalism of love and attachment. But what it is Confucianism. There are quotes from Confucius where he says exactly this. So Vice President Vance doesn't even know he's quoting Confucius, but he's clearly attracted by Confucius. He's attracted by the particularism of Confucius rather than the universalism of Jesus. So we have here another example of important political social actors in the US that seem attracted by ideas that are coming from Asia. It's also a new situation in that respect.
You seem like you were telling me before the call that you've also spent some time in India. And you seem like you've spent quite a lot of time thinking about what it might mean if there is an upending of, as you say, 500 years of a global order. When you talk to people in the West, do you think there is any understanding at how quickly that wave is coming?
No, there isn't. Not just there's no understanding of how quickly it's happening, because, by the way, it isn't happening that quickly, but it could accelerate. But I think the real problem is that there's no understanding or awareness that it is happening. People really think it isn't happening. They think that perhaps some countries are catching up. They're learning a few things from us, but there's no understanding that, in fact, first, they are now doing some things better than us. They're innovating. Second, that with new powers in Asia, the leading ideas, the leading culture, the leading way of looking at the world will also change. It's not that they will become better than us as being Western. The leading ideas of the world will no longer be Western. The hierarchy will no longer be with the West on top. So all this will be extremely traumatic, and perhaps because it is extremely traumatic, there's no awareness or knowledge that it is happening. It's being actually actively repressed, the knowledge of this.
Let's talk about AI itself for a little while. Let's delve in a little bit and about these large language models. You've written that we seem to have reached the point where AI has begun to improve itself rather than having to wait for human engineers, and to do so at computer rather than human speed. One of the reasons for this is that the Chinese company DeepSeek that we've been talking about used something called reinforcement learning to build this AI model. First of all, I wonder if you can explain for the audience what reinforcement learning is, and then secondly, why it potentially allowed them to create something in such a short space of time.
So reinforcement learning is not new. It wasn't invented by DeepSeek. The best example is maybe how to teach a software or a computer to play chess. The best way, and it's the way that's been used in the last decade, and clearly an improvement on older ways to teach a computer to play chess, is just to give them the rules, allow the computer to play many, many games, millions of games. And when the computer wins, it goes back and makes a note to itself that the moves it made were good ones. When a computer loses, then it goes back and it has to correct. So the reinforcement comes from losing or winning, and then the learning is done by the computer, subject to these reward or punishment functions. And basically, you have to do the same for other areas. You have to give rewards or reinforcement for when a particular model is doing well on a particular task. And just allow, just as a child, this is like in an exercise book where you give the answer, but then the student has to learn how to reach that answer instead of giving the computer all the steps to reach the answer. It's that kind of logic.
Right. And the difference in the way that the AI models were trained, the American AI models, the engineers said, this is the right answer. Whereas with reinforcement learning, it's a version of what you were saying about with the metaphor of the child. The child is marking its own homework.
Yes, exactly. So far, the American companies hadn't really come up with a way to do this for AI and for large language models, a reinforcement learning function. And DeepSeek apparently was able to do that. So it's a big, big breakthrough.
One of the fascinating things you say in the book about this is that while it's tempting to imagine AI as this neutral technology ready to do work in service of whoever is typing in instructions, that's not really the case. DeepSeek, for example, very famously, and people kept talking about this is the main thing the reporters tried to feed into DeepSeek, refused to answer questions on Taiwan or Tiananmen Square. And we see this on the opposite side with US models, where some of them won't answer questions on Trump, or they might answer questions about the rights of Israelis or Palestinians very differently. And you've written that there will never be a neutral model, which is, I think, something that most people don't believe is the case with Gemini and ChatGPT.
That's right. And let's not talk about those cases of censorship because they're relatively uninteresting. Let me give you another example. A friend of mine that works in AI and read my article in the New Statesman on AI went to DeepSeek and asked DeepSeek to rate countries according to evil or good they were and how chaotic and organized they were. And DeepSeek quickly lost interest in the exercise. It's quite interesting why, when things become delicate, the model stops answering. But it was still able to give a ranking. And I think he has 20 countries. I'm not going to go through all of them. But Russia, for example, was the only country that was simultaneously evil and chaotic. And there were, other countries. Germany would be organized and good, and other countries would be disorganized but good. Perhaps India. I can't quite remember if India fell into that. I was interested in the case of Russia. I went through the 20 examples, and that seemed to me clearly a kind of an average media opinion in the West about how to rank countries. Now, why is it an average opinion? It's sort of very conventional. The opinion of what sort of a think tank or in a top think tank would have, because it's what people are ready to accept, a very conventionally politically correct view. The model has this opinion because it learns from internet text, and internet text is populated by Western magazines that repeat this.
Right.
And even DeepSeek used internet text. So for the time being, even DeepSeek, even though it's a Chinese model, is reproducing these ideas. But it's easy to imagine that in the future, you can make some amends to this, tweak the text that is being used, select some text in some ways, and you end up with a model that has geopolitical views. I have my geopolitical views, you have yours, other people have theirs. But, the troubling thing that should make us think is these models, which are going to become the infrastructure of our societies, will also have geopolitical views of this kind, very wide-ranging, broad, general, about how they organize the world, how they view the world. There will be a worldview incorporated into these models.
And you think that people won't really notice those worldviews?
No, of course not. Because, by the way, then these worldviews will not come out simply in direct questions where they might be revealed, but they will come up in all kinds of subtle ways. They will come up in the ways that factories are organized, because factories are going to be organized on the basis of these models. And so in rather unpredictable, subtle, profound, systemic, structural ways, these views are going to organize social economic processes in the future. I'm not talking about 2025, but I'm certainly talking about 2035.
I thought when you started telling the story about your friend, your colleague, I thought that it was going to go in a different direction. I thought that DeepSeek, being a Chinese model, was, when asked to rank which countries are successful, was going to privilege those countries that were organized and structured ahead of those countries that are chaotic. And I thought that is where it was going, that there was perhaps in the background of the model this idea that something organized like the Chinese state is much better than something disorganized like the American state. That isn't what happened, but you can imagine that might be a distinction.
Right. Well, for the time being, the text, and we're talking about millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of internet pages. The text is dominated by Western views. And by the way, DeepSeek is not interested in that. DeepSeek is not a CCP project. You may soon hear that coming from Washington. So they're not interested in that. They're just interested in being successful, creating a very powerful model. But in the future, this can be changed. Obviously, it will involve manipulating internet text in some ways, selecting some parts of it, introducing other parts. Potentially, what you can do in the future is use AI models to produce text that is then going to be used to train that AI model or other AI models. There are ways to do this, but for the time being, obviously, we all know this, the internet is dominated by Western ideas.
There was something that happened to me when I was playing around with ChatGPT, and I wanted to see what you thought of it. I was doing this trend which you saw on TikTok where you ask ChatGPT to talk about a day in the life of someone. So you say, tell me a day in the life of a computer engineer in 30 years, or tell me a day in the life of a medieval peasant, something like that, right? And I noticed while they were doing this, while ChatGPT was doing this, every example of a character was a woman. And I thought, that's interesting. How come every example is a woman? So I asked ChatGPT. I said, how come you're coming up with these examples and every example you've given me is of a female character? And ChatGPT said to me, well, it's because it's very important that you have these characters and that you don't only use men. And I thought, that is a very interesting encoded Western conception of gender and language. And it's not even a particularly liberal encoding of it. It's like a specific Western liberal left-wing conception of gender.
Yes, that doesn't come from the text or the training. It's in a more brutal way to manipulate the model, where when you prompt it, the model immediately changes your prompt. And so when you say, give me an example of someone in the 13th century, there's a little line of code that changes your prompt into something like, give me an example of a woman in the 13th century. So this can be done in rather brutal ways. I think what happened was that AI models, large language models, were being developed at the height of the wokeness fever around, even 2020, the Floyd protests and so on. So there's a lot of effort to do this. I suspect it's going to disappear because now we live in a different cultural environment. But, other prompt injections, that's a technical term for this, are going to be used. Other ways of supervising, training the model are going to be used. Other ways of manipulating the model's weights are going to be used. Other ways to use selective text are going to be used. There's absolutely no way you're going to have a neutral model. But this is a philosophical question. There are no neutral models. That's not the mind of God. It's a mind that has been created by other minds. And so you get the biases of those other minds, but you also get the biases that are deliberately introduced into the model for all kinds of political, economic, or social reasons.
Do you think that there is a problem that we, the users, cannot put in these prompt injections? So, for example, the example that you've given and others have given is that you ask these large language models if Israelis deserve a homeland. They say absolutely. You say, do Palestinians? And they go, well, it's complicated. And I wondered if there's an issue there that we don't have the ability to change it, because, for example, it should be relatively straightforward. It should be possible to say to the AI, hey, these are both people, and the AI goes, gotcha, you're totally right, I'll change that. But it doesn't do that. We don't have the ability to do that.
No, we don't have the ability to do that. And even more interesting, the model itself, as I think you said, doesn't have the ability to do that. The model doesn't have the ability to step outside itself. This is the old philosophical problem of the fish that doesn't see anything outside its world of water and the confines. These models are like that. They live inside their own boxes and they have no ability to step outside. So if we create a generation of people, particularly our children that are using the models now repeatedly, that rely on them to learn how to think, then they themselves will think inside these little boxes that were created for the model. It is obviously very troubling, but I think it also illustrates the thesis in my book that someone builds the world and others, unfortunately, have the much secondary role of just inhabiting the world that was built by others.
Do you think that, as you say, they build these models and then the rest of us kind of have to inhabit them? But don't you think that because there is such an awareness that these models have a worldview, that in time you might get the ability to change the underlying rules? I've thought of myself that it might be relatively straightforward. You could, just as I said to the AI, hey, how come you're always offering up one particular gender? I could say to the AI, hey, how come you're offering up European examples? Why not offer African examples? And it could change the model itself.
I think those are relatively simple and straightforward examples, but there will be so many others that are subtle and they'll work invisibly. We all know this from our experience. We're shaped by our books. The problem now is that there will be one giant book, the model itself, and it will shape everything. And it won't just, the books in the past, they shaped our hours of reading and they shaped our classroom teachings and so on. But there was a physical world outside. What I'm talking about is that the model now is going to become a book that is everywhere, not just in the classroom and in the library, but is in the factories, is in the emotional, personal, romantic experiences that we have, is in social processes, is in the internet itself, is in the media, is in robots. So we live inside a book and not just reading a book. I think that's how I see these models in the future. By the way, it's a return to a culture of books rather than physical experience. I mentioned that in the book in passing, that it's quite interesting that we seem to be back to the medieval world where books rule rather than what is called empiricism of going out into the physical world and testing things. We're back to scholasticism because the model should be seen really as a giant book, and the book now determines everything.
And you can imagine that at the moment, maybe people are still on Google. They have direct access to the information that is put on the internet, and Google simply indexes it. But you can imagine a situation, which I think is already happening, where people are moving from Google search, they're moving to, for example, ChatGPT or Gemini, and then they don't even know what the underlying text is. They don't know what is contained within that text. They just see the answer.
I think it's worse than that, because don't forget that you can use Google, which is not an AI model and allows you to be in control. But the search results are shaped by the AI models, because so much of the internet is now being written by AI models. So many magazines are fully written by ChatGPT and other models. A lot of the media, a lot of pages, Wikipedia pages are going to be written by them. So yeah, you can have a tool like Google that is free from those biases, but the internet is not. I don't know. I'd like to know what percentage of the internet right now has been written by AI models. Of course, for now, it's only been 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
It's small, but it might already be 1 or 2%. And very quickly, we'll get to half of the internet, 2/3 of the internet. You can't compete with these models. They write a lot more and a lot faster. They can produce a book in 2 seconds. And for me, it took 2 years. So there's no way you're going to be able to compete with them. All the content is going to be produced by AI models very soon.
Yeah, I made this point in a previous podcast that we will get to a point, maybe within the next couple of years, that was my brief prediction, where the majority of information on the internet will be written by AI.
Right.
Very soon, right?
Right. So at that point, you lose access to an internet that is free of these AI models. And then when they occupy our workplaces, our factories, you lose access to another uncontaminated part of our world. And soon enough, there might not be anything left apart from pure empty spaces of the ocean or the beach where you can maybe take some walks, but then you return to the model.
What do you think the democratic implications of that are then?
Well, I think mostly geopolitical implications, because it's going to be the most powerful states that are coming up with these models and shaping them in certain directions. Democracy might still happen within these confines. I think democracy already today happens within these sort of confines. Democracy happens within American culture, and American democracy has almost no ability to step outside American culture. So I'm more concerned with the geopolitical implications, with the kind of global hierarchy, than about democracy. In some cases, yes, they will be used to consolidate the power of one autocrat, of one ruler, but that's already the case as well. But it clearly creates a world where there are no neutral spaces between the great powers, and where the balance between great powers is not given by the natural physical world, but in fact disappears, and it becomes extremely hierarchical.
I want us to move on because I'm very interested in the review you wrote about Robert Kaplan's latest book. We had Robert Kaplan, the realist thinker and writer, on the podcast recently, and he was talking about the book that you reviewed, Wasteland. And I want to hear what your views are in the context of our discussion. In the book, Kaplan settles on the Weimar Republic. This was the short-lived German Republic that immediately preceded the rise of the Nazis, for an appropriate analogy for today's politics. And he extends it not just to the American example, but to the global order, and he arrives at a concept that he calls the geopolitical Weimar. Now, you reviewed his book, and you wrote, in Kaplan's definition, it is the moment when the existing global order starts to unravel because humanity, enamored with new technologies and limitless possibility, forgets that, quote, order must come before freedom, and hierarchy is everything. Do you think that analogy is useful, firstly, on a global scale?
I'm attracted by this idea of thinking about the global order in terms that are inspired by domestic politics. So I like to think, for example, of what's happening in the global order as a revolutionary moment, a moment where a regime is being replaced by another. I'm on the same wavelength as Kaplan so far. But obviously, the moment I opened the book, read the first page, I knew where he was going. Because when you start talking about Weimar, or perhaps about the terror in the French Revolution, what you're saying immediately becomes apparent is that we have to step back. Things are getting out of control. We're heading to the precipice. And, Weimar is an even more powerful image than the terror, because Weimar just places the reader between this option of either go back to what things used to be,
Yeah.
or then we're going to have Hitler.
Yeah.
We're going to have a kind of a Hitler on a global scale. So it's a conservative sleight of hand that Kaplan is using to try to convince us all that we're entering very dangerous waters and we should just go back to a safe harbor.
You accept the principle that we are almost between two ages, that there is such a thing as American, maybe Western decline, but you don't accept that that means what I think Kaplan thinks, that there will be an age of global decline.
I mean, that could well be an age of global decline, in the sense that the transitions between orders might not be extraordinary moments of stability and peace. They will be very creative, and probably will get great philosophy, great art, great literature, but we might not get peace of the kind that we had for the last 78 years, particularly in the West. But perhaps even at a global level, there were no world wars, so that is true. But we cannot stop the movement of history. That is the main point that I'm making.
When you talk about this potentially creative destruction, I mean, you say it casually, but I mean, it sounds like it could be a period of very serious wars. This is partly what your Ukrainian colleague was pointing out at the very beginning, that it's all very well to talk about virtual landscapes and virtual worlds, but actually there's a hard reality to it. You look at the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war was a real brutal war, as was Gaza. This stuff is real.
Yes, of course. And it's part of the process that we're describing here. I remain convinced that we're heading towards a world war simply because of nuclear weapons. I think that still holds valid, that we know that wars cannot be won, particularly the kind of wars we're talking about. World wars, great wars, systemic wars. Wars to determine who rules the world have become impossible in some sense. I still believe in that. And I think what we're seeing, the dynamics between the US and China reveal that on the one hand, there's a big battle going on to decide who rules the world. But I think that battle is happening not through an open war, but through the kind of processes I describe in the book and described in this podcast, where you try to build a world that the other side will be forced to inhabit. I think it is a more constructive process than the process of destroying the world in order to build a new one, determined and ruled by a different actor. That's usually how things happen when we're talking about transitions between world orders in the past, and great wars were used to create new orders. I don't think it's going to happen simply because, in that sense, nuclear weapons have changed the equation.
Do you think then that is the problem that Kaplan has within the book, that he is very concerned about this global order changing, but he's mainly concerned because he doesn't want the West to decline?
Yes, it seems very obvious to me. I think it's genuine in some sense. I think Kaplan should have made a bigger effort of knowing more about the rest of the world, and then perhaps he wouldn't be as scared as he obviously is by the possibility that the rest of the world will have more power. He presents a picture where, in fact, Africa is just a dystopian picture of, as he describes it, I'm quoting, of garbage heaps on the suburbs of large cities, where India doesn't exist, where China is this authoritarian machine-like state that is getting ready to devour the rest of the world. If you build these pictures for yourself, and they are pictures, no doubt about that, they are pictures, they are not the reality, then yes, you are going to be terrified of a world where these actors will have power and you'll have less power. But I think it's an illusion here. You see that you like your world because it's yours. You don't like those other worlds because they are not yours. But the role of a geopolitical thinker, of a political thinker, is to rise above these particular perspectives. We have to try to be objective. We have to look at different parts of the world, not from the point of view of our own armchair.
I want to end by asking you about your own feelings about your role as a geopolitical thinker. You focus a lot on these very big questions. And in the past, that might have been called like public intellectual questions. I wonder how you feel now. We were saying just before we came on that it's a little bit strange for you saying to move in from the world of academia and the world of politics into kind of being a journalist now. I wonder how you feel that the public responds to these big questions.
I think the public likes it. There's a lot of pressure from states and the apparatus that exists around states. The more I learn about it from experience, because there's no other way to learn it. The states in the West have become extremely powerful in the way they create a whole apparatus of think tanks, universities, media. And it is this apparatus that is an obstacle to free thought and freedom of expression. I think the public likes to hear different views and is interested in different views. So there's still a role for the public intellectual, but I think there are very few public intellectuals today because there's very little space for intellectual freedom of that kind. If you work in a think tank, if you work in a university, you're captured by these networks of power. They are extremely powerful. And they're also extremely powerful at creating thick layers of propaganda. So it takes many years, not to say decades, to free yourself from them.
Bruno Maçães, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Bruno's book, World Builders, Technology and the New Geopolitics, is out now from Cambridge University Press. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.